for United Arab Emirates. And welcome to a session on networking and leadership with Jim Emerick. We're glad to have Jim. Jim is a founder and president of Profit with Purpose Choinque LLC. Now, Choinque is an international network of organizations in relentless pursuit of the good and best within themselves, and even more so, in others. Now, often this is accomplished by aligning leaders with their organizational values and achieving breakthrough performance via an inspired and engaged workforce. Jim is an academy leadership master facilitator and has trained and coached over 1,000 professionals in the US, Canada, Australia, UK, Spain, Germany, Peru, and Chile. So Jim has literally been all over the world. Jim is a graduate of the US Air Force Academy. He served as a technology program manager, developing and integrating the next generation spacecraft computers in over 50 platforms, including Cassini-Huygens probe. In 1992, he co-founded and led Innovative Systems and Technologies Corporation, pioneering 3 breakthrough generations of radio frequency systems on chips with the diverse teams in US, Scotland, and Canada. Later on in 2006, he did sell that company, after which he served as a president, Advanced Technologies at ITT. Now, Jim is very active on LinkedIn and Twitter, and he hosts a podcast, the Choinque Cast, which may be found via iTunes and is also accessible on other platforms. Jim has read and reviewed over 100 books on leadership by authors worldwide. Now, you could find those books on bookshelves and also on choinque.com. A bit of Jim's personal life. Jim, he serves currently as the fundraising chair of Autism Speaks Tampa, that's Tampa, Florida, and supports a variety of causes. Jim and his wonderful wife, Cheryl, they are 2 awesome children. Their 3 cats can be found in Tampa, Florida, or in the mountains of Colorado. Now, before we hand over to Jim, I just want to talk about a few housekeeping rules. First has to do with how the series is going to run. So we're going to have Jim lead the presentation. And if you do have questions, please type your questions in the chat box. And at the end of the session, I will curate your questions and address them to the speaker as and when required. Now, all eligible PDUs will be awarded to attendees, so you will not have a cost to apply for this. It will be automatically credited to you. If you're experiencing network issues, please be informed and just be patient. If the issues persist, you can actually log out and try and log in again. And with that said, I'm going to give a warm welcome and hand over to Jim Emerick on the session, Networking and Leadership.
Thank you very much, Obi. And I also want to thank Rosanna and Abdul, and I'm sure there's others that I haven't connected with that are involved. I'm thrilled with the number of participants. So for me, we're setting a record for the number of participants on a WebEx. And if you don't hear me well, please let me know. I hope my background picture looks appropriate, because I wanted to make sure that I combined both PMI, the lovely landscape in the back, and also my own Choinque logo. Mostly I want to express gratitude for being able to do this, and I appreciate reading the background. It helps set up what we do. Much of the leadership work that I conduct is done with a group called Academy of Leadership, and my guess is we'll probably look in the future at attempting to have an event with some of the Academy Leadership materials. And the Academy Leadership Group is simply a group of people from the US who are former military officers who have senior executive experience as a civilian. So I'm one of those folks. And we're fortunate, our Academy Leadership Group, that we've had a very strong relationship with PMI. However, our focus for at least the last 10 years with PMI has simply been on leadership. And we can probably all recall that several years ago, PMI changed the talent triangle. And one of those legs of the talent triangle included leadership. And I think that was a really interesting recognition and a big opportunity. To me, it gives us an opportunity to find, explore, and share purpose in terms of what we do. And what I mean by that is, in my 20s, I was a little bit younger, and I was a program manager for the Air Force. The PMI credentials probably didn't exist then, although I had some training. But part of my journey as a program manager at a young age was realizing that there's more to having a successful program and leading people than just the technical skills and the credentials and all of those terms and phrases we use to run a successful program. And it's been my impression that the PMI organization has recognized the same. Obviously, it's very important to have a lot of skills, but there's more to that when it comes to leading things. And obviously, when you want to try a project, especially a very different one, there's other skills involved that we could call soft skills or the leadership skills. And I thought that when that talent triangle changed to recognize leadership, it would create an opportunity for me to connect with people throughout the world. And that's what's led to a lot of the international work and connecting with people worldwide. I find that particularly energizing, and I look forward to not just this talk, but to the relationship we can form. So let's go over what we're going to cover here. I think a lot of us have our own definitions of what we think networking is. And I'll be the first one to admit, on LinkedIn, I am an open networker, which means that if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'll usually say, let's go ahead and connect. But we've probably found this in practice that many people, I think especially younger ones, often when they want to connect, they're mostly wanting to sell something, and they'll start with a statement that says, hi, I'd like to learn more about you. Can we have a phone call? Or something like that, or they'll connect and they'll immediately try to sell something. And I think that's because of perceptions we have of what networking is. I find it sometimes a little bit annoying, but mostly amusing, that someone will reach out to me on LinkedIn and say, I want to learn more about you, when I have a website, I have podcasts, I have over 100 book reviews, and probably 100,000 words published in my newsletters, all on my website. So if someone wants to learn more about me, I'm not necessary for them to do that, but obviously they must have a different idea of what networking is. So we'll look at that, and I'll share some stories. I'll share some stories about how my definition of networking, I believe, changed, and how that affected me in growing a technology company, and to share some lessons on how we can use ways of engagement and connecting with each other, especially in a year like this one, this COVID year, when many clients have told me, especially in coaching sessions, that it's difficult to connect with people and it's difficult to have a work-life balance. So let's go ahead and do all of that. This will probably take more than an hour for the talk, but I'm certainly happy to stay longer, especially to answer your questions. So if we ask ourselves the question, what is networking? We can ask this in a couple different ways. I asked my family to help me with this on what some of the common perceptions are. But I think a lot of the things that we attribute to networking fall into these types of categories that we're looking at right now. I don't think these are great definitions, but I think they're common. And interesting enough, I've used this and got poll responses before, and the two that got the strongest responses from the audience so far are attending social events and schmoozing at work. Those seem to be the real strong ones. And then at the end there, I put in there, a lot of people think that networking is only about getting a job. Obviously, it can lead to that, but maybe there's a better definition that we can use for that. If we think about how can we think about this and what can lead to networking? Let's look at this great phrase from Brene Brown. It's from her book, Daring Greatly. After 10 years of coaching people, professionals, whether they be company presidents, junior people, I believe this is true. And I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, where does this disengagement come from? Where does this need for a sense of purpose come from? Especially if we're living in a time when we have all this technology to connect. How can that be happening? I remember driving my daughter and some of her friends to swim practice after school, and they would be texting each other, right? They would text each other with their phones, and they're in the back seat of a car or driving, going to swimming practice after school. And I might ask my daughter later how her friends are doing. Hey, how are your friends doing? And she'd say, I don't know. I said, well, you were just with them for 3 hours. You were just talking with them. And so there's all this technology, but it doesn't mean we know how to connect with each other. So let's focus a little bit more on these terms, engagement and purpose, because it's a pretty big deal. One of the authors who's writing a lot about this is a gentleman named Mark Crowley, and he wrote a really interesting book called Lead from the Heart. Now, this is someone who was very successful in the financial services business for 25 years. And I'm sure that they focused a lot on money, but he found out that when you start focusing on people and connecting with them deeply, it led to much higher engagement and fulfillment in the workplace. So we'll talk about Mark Crowley in that book a little bit later, because there's an important thing he shared with me that I want to share with you, and we'll do that more towards the end. But this whole concept again of engagement and motivation are pretty important. And we might ask ourselves, are these just soft skills? Are these things that are kind of fuzzy, hard to measure, maybe not that important, maybe only results matter? Well, let's look at what happened. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this picture, but this is a picture of the Air Force Academy, where I was fortunate enough to attend quite a number of years ago. And earlier this year, when the COVID pandemic started affecting everybody, the Air Force Academy, like many institutions, had to figure out what to do to send the students or the cadets home. Now, the other service academies, the Military Academy or West Point, the Naval Academy at Annapolis, they sent all of the cadets home. The Air Force Academy, for whatever reason, chose something different. They allowed the senior class, the ones who were going to graduate in a couple of months, we call them firsties because they're in their first classmen. So maybe 1,000 of them, maybe 950, they stayed at the Air Force Academy, but they were isolated. They had to do their courses remotely. They didn't even go to the chow hall to have the meal for their meals together. They had the meals brought to them. And here's a fun question. Now remember, these are people who are highly trained, they're highly educated, and they're about to become officers in just a few months. Guess what happened after just a couple of weeks of that isolation? They started killing themselves. After only about 2 weeks, suicides started. And it was shocking. So it wasn't a very popular thing in the news. I think I only found out when I was visiting Colorado, because we go back and forth there. But think about that. What had happened where the conditions were right, where we isolated people, even though they knew they were going to graduate soon and they should have been focused on things positively, put them in an environment where they're disconnected and detached, and maybe even lost their sense of purpose. And that's something we've got to be very mindful of as leaders. So it kind of really brings the point home. And of course, the Air Force Academy had to make some adjustments. I hope in the future I can learn a little bit more about what led to that and the decision-making processes, and most importantly, what learnings occurred from that. So this topic called engagement is a big deal, and I've got another slide here, again from Brene Brown. This is what I call my takeaway quote from that entire book I think that this is really important. I think how we connect with people is probably more important, certainly as adults, than anything else in our lives. I hope it's true. I hope it's true with our kids, especially our 23-year-old daughter. But look what it says. How we engage with people is very, very important. This was clear to me a couple of weeks ago in a coaching call with a professional in Atlanta. And it was just a normal coaching call, but she was very excited with the coaching call. And she was leaning into the screen, right? You've seen people do that when we're doing these things on WebEx and Zoom. And the reason why she was leaning in, and the reason why that was happening, it wasn't because of my coaching ability. It's because she wanted to tell me some fun things that she was doing. She wanted to connect. And she one of the things she wanted to tell me was, because she didn't have to spend so much time driving to work every day, she was going to be able to speed up her work on her PhD. And she was excited about that. She wanted to tell me about that. And it turns out she works for the Centers for Disease Control through her company, and she's actually helping to solve the whole COVID pandemic. And she wanted to tell me about that. And it was a reminder to me that people are thirsty for engagement. So how can we think about this, right, in this session? How can we process all of this, and how can we start another way to think about networking? And I think it starts with knowing ourselves, and we can go deeper than that. So this is a neat graphic. I think it's a good one for us to think about, especially this year. But in general, this is pretty interesting. Notice what's really small there in the middle, that purpose statement. A lot of things need to come together for us to be finding our sense of purpose. It might take us a lot of our lives to figure that out. So it's a very, very big deal. But if we think about these things, this to me can become the basis, the starting point for how we think about networking. I'd like to think of university commencement speeches. Often the speaker says, well, find out what you love to do and pursue that. Well, that might be helpful and it might be rewarding, but it might not help you get paid. It might not be what the world needs, right? So we might have to find a couple different things there to get this working. So let's go back in time. Let's go back in time with me about 30 years. And I am in my mid to late 20s. I'm in school, right? I have my undergraduate degree in electrical engineering, but now I'm in business school. I want to learn how business works. And I'm also a junior officer working on a neat program, right, to develop some technology that we already discussed. Now, one of the things I liked about business school is when my instructors would bring in a real live entrepreneur, someone who actually had started their own business, and they were always had a lot of energy, and they were very excited. Now, keep in mind, this is the late 1980s and the early 1990s. We weren't using email the way we use it today. We weren't using the web the way we're using it today. And this young man, I'll never forget him. His name was Doug Mellinger, and he had started a company, and he wanted to tell us how he went around connecting with people and networking. He suggested to us, he said, next time you go to the library, and I was actually living in Albuquerque at the time. That library you see there is the library at the University of New Mexico. So he told us, next time you go to the library, make sure you look up this thing called the Encyclopedia of Associations. I'd never heard of it before. He said, if there's something that you really, really like to do a lot, there's probably there's a group of people that probably have that same interest. And you'll find those organizations in the Encyclopedia of Associations. And think about that. We're talking now maybe about people you might find who have things you love in common. Maybe it's something you have passion about. It could be your vocation. It could be a whole bunch of those things. Profession. It might be any of those things. But I thought, what an interesting way to connect with people. So I did what he suggested. I took a look at that and I was really surprised. And there was more than one volume. There were hundreds of them. I remember a lot of them were in Washington, D.C. So I decided to apply that to something I wanted to study. And this is just one example. I wanted to study what marketing opportunities there were in the United States since recycling and, let's say, this focus on ecology was becoming important. So I wanted to study that. I wanted to learn about that and write a paper about that for school. I went to that Encyclopedia of Associations and I looked up for organizations that were involved in renewable recycling, things like that. And it turns out there were hundreds of organizations. So I took that encyclopedia, I found the pages, and I made copies with photocopies. And I decided that I was going to write everybody a letter to let them know that I was really interested in what they did. Now think about what's going on in this letter. I'm really excited about what you do. I want to learn more about what you do. Can we share some information? Can you help me out with any of this? Also, I wanted to let them know I was in school. And imagine, what you would write or what we would write today if we're sending a letter to someone we don't know and have a common interest. Because the things that we put in a letter like that, whether it was back in 1990 or today, usually when we get something like an email or a LinkedIn connection message, it's a different message. We often don't stop to let people know that we're genuinely interested, that we're curious, that we want to know more about them. And the fun part was, guess what happened when I sent those letters out? I probably sent between 50, sometimes to 100 to 200. And the fun response is, I got so much mail back. That's why I'm showing this picture here. We had to put the mail in boxes because there was so much. Almost just about everybody replied, and they would send brochures, they would send letters, they would send pamphlets, they would show legislation they were starting. There was so much information sent to me. And I did these mailings maybe 3 or 4 times. I got a big map, a big poster board map of the United States with push pins on it. And within a few months, I probably knew as much about what was going on with recycling in the United States as anybody else. And it was simply because I connected with people and asked them. I wasn't looking for newspaper articles or books. I was just connecting with people. But what was magical is they wanted to share. And that really left an impression on me. And it proved to me that Doug Mellinger was right. He was right when he wanted that to happen. So when I showed my work to my instructor, and this was kind of an independent study, my instructor said, Jim, I compiled all my information. I had a written report, and then I had a whole bunch of appendices in the back for every state. And it was in 2 big binders, 2 binders worth of stuff. My instructor said, this is more than 1 semester's worth of work. He said, you've got 2 semesters worth of work here. It was like a thesis. And the fun part was I didn't even think about that. I was just trying to put it all together. And it was a neat exercise. So let's fast forward. So that a couple of years later, I did leave the Air Force. I fell in love with developing technology, and I was learning a big lesson that the way to do marvelous things with technology was actually the way you form teams and connected with people. I was starting to learn something akin to the leadership leg of a talent triangle. I didn't have the words to describe it, but I knew that people were the key to making breakthrough things happen. And I was excited to start doing that in my own company with some friends. So this is actually a picture of a research center for IBM. It's in upstate New York. It's called the TJ Watson Research Center. And there are 2,000, or there were, at the time I worked with them, there were 2,000 PhDs all in that single building. You could call it IBM's brain trust. And the company that we started, eventually we started becoming really good integrated circuit or chip designers. That's what we started doing. And if you want to be a good integrated circuit or chip designer, you need to understand some semiconductor physics. You need to understand the physical material properties of the semiconductor that you're going to fabricate your technology in. And don't mistake me for that person, but we had people who understood that in the company. So it's a very exciting company. Turns out that this was around the late 1990s, right? It was about 10 years later now from that prior story. And what was really interesting is some of the folks on our team said, Jim, there's a new technology that IBM has. It's a semiconductor technology and it's based on silicon and germanium. And they kept telling me that, and they were telling me for a reason. So eventually I came to understand that they were saying it was a process technology that could allow a new breakthrough kind of integrated circuit to be designed and built. We could fuse both analog and digital technologies together, and that's a real big deal, certainly was at the time. Now think about this. We're a little company here in the Tampa Bay area, and this is billion-dollar technology that IBM has, and I wanted to get my hands on it somehow. So again, I fell back onto those lessons. I fell back onto the Doug Mellinger lesson. I remembered what I had done in school, and I started reaching out to IBM. This took a while, but think about it. I was thinking about the common purpose and common passions and all of those things. And eventually I found my way to a gentleman named Dr. Dean Herman. He was a 1960 West Point graduate, so we had the military in common. And he was also the assistant to the IBM technical fellow who had invented this technology. And that person's name is Dr. Bernard Meyerson, or Bernie Meyerson, and he's still a tech fellow at IBM. Let's imagine what was happening. Let's remember what was happening in the late 1990s. We can think of that as the internet boom. Everyone wanted fast data pipes. They wanted data to be able to move very quickly. Companies like Nortel that provided that technology were really soaring in size, and they couldn't get enough work. They couldn't hire enough people. Well, I found out that this wonderful process technology that IBM had, no one wanted to use it for what it could really do. I started spending time with Dean Herman, and we had fun. We would talk about anything. We'd go out to dinner. We'd drink some scotch together. We had a good time. And I got to the point where I said, well, Dean, what's going on with this technology? People must be going crazy because of the new thing that you could use it for. And he tells me, well, we're actually being paid to screw up the recipe. We're being paid to change the doping because everyone just wants the technology to go very fast. And the silicon germanium technology could be used to go fast, but it was a better integrated technology. So I said to him, you mean to tell me that no one wants to use this technology for what it can do? And he said, correct. And I said, well, our little company would like to. And he said, for real? And I said, yeah. So they said, but Jim, no one even knows how to design in this technology yet. And I said, we could do that. We could build out the design kits to do that. And I understand, I'm about to make the best sale of my life probably here. Okay, this is crazy. So I leave New York that trip, and I come back to our offices here in Florida, and we have the technology to use, this billion-dollar technology, and we're actually being paid by IBM to create integrated circuits no one else in the world had ever done before. So it's crazy. It's like a dream come true. But what I think really happened was no one wanted to pay IBM to do what their dream was, their ultimate purpose for that technology. And I think what happened for the first time when I started talking with Dean and Bernie about that was they realized they found another organization, a very small one, ours, that had common purpose. And it was like electricity. So it's not a surprise then. And this is a very rare picture. I don't show to many people, but this is the first test chip that created the world's first radio frequency systems on chip. And this was done over 20 years ago. And I suspected that we had created something no one else in the world had done, because when we streamed this design digitally to IBM so that they could fabricate it, we crashed their servers. Their servers didn't even have the storage capability to import our designs. And I was pretty sure we were in territory no one else was at that point. So a fun question for the group is guess which company was the first one that wanted to buy our little company? It's not a trick question. So it was IBM. It was IBM, and eventually, I've already mentioned in the introduction, ITT ultimately acquired our company, and that's a whole nother set of stories there. But notice that what's on top here, this technology was realized because of common purpose. There were a lot of other things. A lot of things had to be managed very well, but what held it all together was common purpose between a bunch of different organizations. And I felt that my job as the president and CEO of the company was to make sure that I kept that common purpose aligned. Because I think when I did that, anything was possible. So how can we translate this to the workplace today? How can we think about this? One of the things that comes up a lot right now is, especially in strategy sessions, we seem to be pretty good when we're operating within our own organization, say with common goals, aligned goals, or maybe all of the people in our program all directly report to us and we're all in the same company. That doesn't seem to be so hard these days. But look at what this says. When executives are being interviewed now, where things are breaking down, and I bet this really affects this audience, is what happens when we have dependencies on others that we don't have authority over, that we don't say have line control over. They're in another division or another company, maybe even another culture. That's what really seems to be holding us back. This comes up all the time now in my leadership classes. It doesn't matter where in the world we are. And it's something that we address a lot. And there's ways to address that, but this seems to be a really tricky thing. These dependencies on other organizations. I recall reading Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams. He had the same issue, and he wrote about that. And in many instances, there's a nice, simple thing that we can do. For example, with Stanley McChrystal, he wrote the book Team of Teams. And what that really meant was when we have, let's say, different groups all contributing to a single project, well, a very simple thing to do, it's not a difficult process, is what if everyone at the individual level on each team simply connected with somebody on all the other teams? Think about that. If each team member needed to connect with or know just one other person on the other teams, that's where the concept of Team of Teams comes from. And I just made this little slide to show what it could look like, to show shapes as the different functions. So if everyone just connects with one person on all the others, what happens is the sharing occurs, the knowledge occurs, and if we have a shared mission and a shared purpose in a program, then we're going to feel more sense of accountability to not let those other people we know down. It's not a complicated model, but it goes back to connecting with people. And I remember reading about that in Team of Teams, and that was inspiring. And the fun part for me was I realized I think I had done the same thing. About 10 years after, well, maybe not quite 10, almost 10 years after that experience with IBM, I was now part of another company. I was part of another company called ITT, or so a big company buys a little company. And this is actually a picture of the site. This was the headquarters. This was now the site that my former company reported into. And very similar to what Stanley McChrystal or connecting with people, I found that my role, now that I'm not the CEO, I'm now either a director or a vice president, I needed to connect with all of my functional counterparts. So I needed to connect with operations, HR, engineering, finance, legal, business development, security, all these different functions. And very similarly, I wanted to make all those connections happen. And I was surprised when I did that, because some of the groups that I thought were going to be very difficult to connect with actually turned out to be some of my best connections. There were some of them, like the legal department, the engineering department, that I thought were going to be tough, and they were tough. But there were several that were surprising, and that was a big key for us to be able to continue developing breakthrough technology. Even though now I wasn't in the government anymore, I wasn't in a small company. Now I'm in a bigger company. I started to realize all of the same principles applied for how to have breakthrough technology programs succeed. So let's ask ourselves now, let's ask ourselves another interesting question. And this leader focus, what we're going to look at here briefly, is what happens when we have our focus on either, say, people, or if we're focused just on results. It's my impression and my experience, especially with all the people I've worked with, that most of us look at one or the other, and we're often trained to focus just on the results. There's probably different reasons for that. I think we're rewarded for that. I think they're often more measurable. How do you measure engagement, for example? I think that's a pretty tough thing to do. So, but we seem to tend to be trained to focus either on results or on people. And I'm going to show you some findings from research by someone named Matt Lieberman, who is writing in Harvard Business Review. And I uncovered this research when I was reviewing a book called Counter Mentor Leadership. Counter Mentor Leadership. It was written by a father-son team named Kelly and Robbie Riggs. This is one of the books on my bookshelf, and it's from 2018. So let's ask ourselves this question. If we focus primarily on social skills, if we focus primarily on social skills or people, what percentage of the time are we seen as a great leader? So just ask yourself that now real quick. Is it 50%, 40%, 20%, 80%? Just put a number in your head. But I think you'll find the answer pretty interesting. Okay, so put that number in your head. And what Matt Lieberman found out is when we're focusing, let's say, just on the people part, the soft skills, we're seen as a great leader only 12% of the time. Now, that's not a very impressive number, is it? It's not a very good number. So if we look at the opposite now, what happens now if we focus on just the results? And I have a feeling a lot of us have been trained to focus on results. I'm the first to admit it. I've definitely been trained to focus on results in a lot of different environments. And I think many times when people who are analytically based, highly trained, highly educated, I think we almost default to this at times. And when I'm doing this in front of people, I'll often look at people like, yeah, this is going to go way up, way up. It's going to be a lot higher number because the results are all that matter. Well, the number does go up, but not that much, just a little bit, because it's just a tiny bit. And we can ask ourselves, what's common about both of these numbers, 12% and 14%? They're both kind of low, aren't they? They're not impressive numbers. So now we get to the more interesting part of this research. When we actually focus on people and results, how effective are we now as a leader? What happens to that number? Right, we had 12 and 14% before. They were pretty low. It skyrockets. And this is one of the big takeaways from this webinar that I want to make sure we're all thinking about. That's a staggering number. So think about it. If we have a lot of processes in place and a lot of things to measure results and all of that, but maybe we haven't been focusing on people, this tells us that if we just start focusing on people a little bit, in addition to focusing on results, our leadership effectiveness is going to skyrocket. Of course, one of the ways to make this connection is going to be finding things that lead to shared purpose. shared passions, getting to know people, providing them what they need in the leader role. Now, maybe the most shocking part of this research at all, guess how many leaders actually focus on both of these, both on the people and results? Lieberman found that less than 1% of people actually do that. They might know that it's important, but so almost no one does that. So here's a really effective thing to try if we haven't been doing both. If we just take the smallest steps towards doing both, and almost no one does it, it's like a secret weapon to do something that no one else does. So let's return to Mark Crowley really quick here. In his book, Lead from the Heart, and I'm going to describe his answer to a question because we didn't get the audio to play. But when I interviewed Mark Crowley, who wrote Lead from the Heart, he did a lot of research on what contributes to engagement in the workforce today. And when he wrote his book, he said there were 4 factors that lead to engagement that contribute to 67% of engagement. And one of those factors he called managerial quality. And I encourage you to go listen to this podcast. It's Choinque number 2. But he gave about a 2-minute answer when I asked him what managerial quality was. And essentially what he told me was, he said, if organizations could do one thing, just one thing, that could affect engagement the most, it would be that they would not consider anyone to be put into a supervisory position that didn't have a history of elevating and promoting other people voluntarily, of their own accord, not because it was a policy. And they would do things like use questions such as that in the interview to find out what people had done. That's worth thinking about, because basically it's saying we won't put anyone in charge of others unless they already have those tendencies to find common passion, common mission, common purpose, and they genuinely care about other people. And it's a spectacular answer, and that's why it might be a good idea to go listen to that. It comes in at, I think, at 9 or 10 minutes into the podcast, but it's a powerful answer. And it's also one of my fun ways to connect with authors and find out these great insights that I can bring into our classes. All these insights from authors like Mark Crowley and many, many others, which I use to make sure that we create the best possible connections when we have our own leadership experiences. So that's the way I like to facilitate my courses. We're facilitators, not instructors. So let's revisit this term networking. Because I like to say many of those things that we were looking at before, I'd say if we're calling those networking, we could probably improve the definition, because I think many times these things that we think networking is actually tend to be more superficial than things that make a difference. And I have a feeling that's why so many of us are struggling with communicating, especially across far distances this year. So I would like to propose now, this is not a textbook definition, this is Jim's definition. So, but I think that this gets closer to the core of what we're looking for. And I believe that networking is really that pursuit of finding those common connections that are the deepest ones inside. My experience has taught me that in the past, and I think we have a responsibility in the leader role to explore things like this when we're connecting with each other. I also think it's a lot more fun. So when we do this, if we ask ourselves if we really do make this a habit, and I think the best evidence of this is the fact that we're having this webinar is a result of this style of networking. It was very fun to connect with Rosanna on LinkedIn just a couple of weeks ago that led to this, because I told her it'd be fun to share something if we could get to know each other and see if we can make a fun connection. So I'll show you a couple of fun examples of what's happened with connecting, and then we can go into our question session. But you probably noticed I like to connect with people through works that others write. I think that in this leadership role I've been in as a facilitator for almost 10 years now, it's taught me that curiosity is a good thing, to stay curious, and there's always more to learn. So here's one author I wanted to connect with. Her name is Misty Burmeister, And if you look at her profile, her website, or her LinkedIn, she sure wants you to know that she's connected to mass media. She's very popular. She's in the know. I hope you can still hear me. Okay, I just froze for a second there. So I reach out to Misty and I ask her if she'll send me a signed copy of her book, and Thought Provoking Greatness. And I think she was shocked that I asked her that. So she called me up and she wanted to know what gives you the right to just contact a stranger and ask for a signed copy of their book. It's pretty aggressive. And this is on the phone. And I said, Misty, I like connecting with authors on Twitter. A lot of people do superficial things on Twitter. A lot of people think it's not a very effective way of communicating, but I find it's a great way to meet new authors. And if an author of a nonfiction book shares that book with me, and I read it, I think about it, I write a detailed review about it, I can't think of a better way to get to know someone anywhere in the world that I haven't met before. So in a way, I'm using what could be considered a very superficial way of communicating to create maybe one of the best initial relationships or connections with someone. That's what I use it for. So I said, what do you think about that? And her answer was very, very funny. She paused and she says very clearly, and she says, Jim, that's a brilliant idea. Why didn't I think of it? So that's Misty. So she sent me her book, and we had a fun review. And she also sent me the names of some other authors. So again, it's another way to think about how do we use all these marvelous ways of communicating and connecting with each other to create the best possible connections. So here's another example. I'll give you one more. It's kind of fun. I was getting ready to give a talk to PMI Australia in 1997. So it wasn't that long ago. And at the same time, I was getting to know a couple authors down there. I reached out to an author named Michelle Gibbons, and I also reached out to Naomi Simpson. Naomi's a little more famous. She's one of the Shark Tank people on TV. But anyway, I asked them for their books, so I'm reviewing their books. And little did I know that both Michelle and Naomi were going to be keynote speakers at the same conference that I was in. And you can see the picture there. You see a picture there with me, and to the right you see Michelle Gibbons. And I just think it's good karma when we create these connections, and this was all a coincidence. So Michelle Gibbons connects with me. Her first book is called Step Up. We end up meeting for breakfast, and it turns out she sends me another book a couple years later, and she said, oh, by the way, Jim, you're on page 96. I wanted to write with everyone about your leadership philosophy. Oh, I got something that just said I am now the host of this event. So I am not sure if someone dropped out, but my video definitely just changed.
That's totally fine.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
No worries. So anyway, so that's my last story. And this is just I encourage you to connect with me. I'm definitely going to stay connected with your chapter and see what else we can do. But that's just fun stuff to follow. I think quite a number of you already connected with me on LinkedIn. I do put out a monthly leadership newsletter. Those of you that I have connected with, I'll add you to. But let's go ahead and transition to your questions. Obviously, I'd like to complete a leadership experience, but let's go ahead and collect some of those questions, because I feel like I've been talking a lot. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim. That's a brilliant session. And just a note to all attendees, you could forward your questions using the chat box. Jim, we've been talking around, leadership, connection, networks. The world is going through a pandemic right now, but there's also an epidemic of loneliness. There's an inability of individuals to actually connect, to engage. How can we practically, break through this whole clutter of technology, innovation, and actually truly form true connections in this very virtual world? Think about the fact that we're now probably all looking to screens. How can you form true engagement and connections in a virtual world?
Well, it's a great question that we're all wrestling with, and one of them, I think we've already found some of those answers. Right? For example, I think that when we all went, let's say, to the remote environment or the WebEx or the Zoom environment, it sure seems we thought about that only as work related. I think that was a very natural thing. So instead of having 6 hours of meetings at work, we had 6 hours of meetings now at work, but at home. So we were taking care of the work part, but we weren't necessarily taking care of the human part. And that's why we started now, and I'm not sure how much it's happening within your audiences, but people are now replicating what we would call social routines also in the virtual environment. Maybe the Friday happy hour, the different things that we can do. We have an autistic son, so he's pretty quiet, but he's wanted to connect with other people. So I think what we have to do is to maybe be a little bit vulnerable and share a little bit more about who we are as people, and not look at the platforms just as another means of doing work.
Yeah, I like the touch around being vulnerable, right? True connections actually dependent on our ability to open up. When it comes to still around connecting, still around the virtual world, still around project management, because I think majority of the audience that we have is actually a project management community. There's the concept or the question around social networking. The fact that how do you promote ethical leadership over social networks, which is really the concept of leading by doing the right things, because you see a lot of that really over social networks. And how do you really promote ethical leadership, especially for the younger audience who are actually primary users of all these social tools?
It's a really good question, and I bet a bunch of people in the audience are parents, so we're all wrestling with this. And let me throw a couple thoughts. When we do something like a 3-day leadership excellence course together, one of the things that we like our attendees to do is to develop what we call a personal leadership philosophy. And that's a very valuable thing to do for any professional. And again, when we usually compose a document like that, it's done for work. I think most of us, when we first write a personal leadership philosophy, that includes, for instance, things as these are what my values are. You might describe what you want the future of your group or your team or your organization to be. You put expectations in there. You put things you won't stand for. Maybe some of your personality quirks. You put in there that it's important to receive feedback so you can grow as a leader. I believe that is a good template, and that we can create an equivalent thing or model to others to do that also in our personal lives. And if we do that, if we practice leadership skills such as that, we're living a leadership philosophy, over time we're probably going to be seen as a leader in all aspects of our lives. And that could be something to share with our children. It could lead to having a family contract. And in that family contract, there could be something that says, we expect you to represent the family, represent yourself as the whole family whenever you put something like a social entry in there, because it's a big challenge, right? That's what's happening. Those things can extend, those leadership principles can extend from the workplace, from the programs to the personal lives as well. Does that help?
No, brilliant answer. We have a question. I'm just going to go to the audience. We have an attendee who's wondering, early on when you were speaking, I perceive you as someone who's an open networker, on LinkedIn, and other social platforms. But there's a question here as to why recruiters kind of like find it, probably offensive, or have the pushback attitude, when they're engaged, by contacts. And a flip side to that question, so I just enhance the question, is how can we avoid that? If you have individuals who are engaging networkers, recruiters online, how can we avoid that pushback and how can we manage that?
That's a great question. And I've got a personal response to that first. My understanding, and I'll pick on LinkedIn a little bit here. I started using LinkedIn seriously maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I am under the impression that some of the people who first used LinkedIn a lot, the ones that had 5,000, 10,000 connections, were often recruiters. And I think recruiters feel a sense of territoriality towards LinkedIn as though it's theirs. It's almost the way I think a newspaper reporter sees the newspaper and print as theirs. So how dare you? I'm the reporter. I'm supposed to interview you. You're not supposed to ask me questions, And I think there's a territoriality that recruiters feel. I think they feel like they have the right to ask anyone anything without disclosing anything. So I think we need to. I don't think that they're necessarily the best to connect with. I would recommend attempting to create a deeper connection with someone on LinkedIn that maybe is not on the recruiting side, maybe someone one step away from them who can influence a recruiter. That's my best guess on the LinkedIn platform. But I think it really has to do with how recruiters see themselves on LinkedIn. That's what I've noticed. Really good question.
Fantastic. Let's switch slightly, to the area of leadership, but still leadership within teams. I just took up a quick look on the book Teams of Teams, and the question around self-organizing teams, just hit me. There's a huge misconception that there isn't a great need for leaders in agile teams. After all, you have each individual managing how they operate. You have a team that is effective on its own. Is there a role? How wrong or how right is this assumption with regards to the need for leadership in agile teams and self-organizing teams?
I'm going to rely on a couple things here, but I think part of that answer can be answered with two terms. And this is some of the material that comes up in our courses. But when we think about the words responsibility and accountability, let's pause and consider those two words: responsibility and accountability. They're used interchangeably sometimes, and when that happens, we tend to confuse them, and we lose the ability to have two different tools in our toolbox. And one of the questions we can ask ourselves to answer that is, what are the sources of those things? Where does responsibility come from? Where does accountability come from? So, for example, and I'll just I'll jump ahead here, but responsibility is something that comes from inside the individual. Accountability is not something that comes from inside the individual. Accountability is an external force. So, for example, let's say one of us hasn't been responsible. Then let's say there's another team member that says, "Hey, Jim, it doesn't look like you're holding up your expectations. You're letting the team down." That's accountability when it's coming from the outside. And this is powerful to bring up because if you're in a leader role, and let's say you're putting a team together, what if you make it a requirement to be on the team, agile team or otherwise? What if there's a requirement to be on the team that you will commit to being held accountable by others, or to hold others accountable when they're not being responsible? So if we use those terms, responsibility and accountability, as powerful tools, we may in fact be able to create a team where others largely hold each other accountable. when that happens, there's probably not that much need for, let's say, quote, a supervisor or quote, leader to be watching over them. But it's often the leadership role that formulates that team. I think there's instances where others may be trained enough or professional enough that they can self-organize. But those tend to be very special, right? We can think about elite military teams as one example, but often it's the leader role or it's the leadership culture of an organization that will stimulate the formation of a team like that. So I like the responsibility, accountability construct. In my opinion, there are many, many professions around the world right now and in business where we're reluctant or have fear. And it's evident. We don't have to look very hard to see evidence of that.
Fantastic. There's a model I was looking at recently in an article I read, and at the core of leadership sits, at the base of that sits accountability-based behavior. And you're 100% correct. It all has to be founded on personal accountability. Team projects are all about, Jim, rather. When you look at projects and you look at the dynamic world we live in right now, and just before I complete my question, I would like to encourage attendees to type their questions. We have a couple of attendees who've raised their hands. Just to avoid disruption in your background and to ensure we actually coordinate the questions, if you could just please type your questions in the chat box and I will pick them up once they're in here. We have about 10 minutes thereabout to wrap up today's session. Jim, I was talking about change. Projects literally about change, driving change, implementing change, sustaining a change that was implemented. And based on the various changes and disruptions that we face around us, you can refer to the concept by Paul Hersey and Ken in their book on the 1 Minute Manager, where they were really looking into the changing styles, the changing requirements for a leader. The changing is about situational leadership. How do you see the need for an individual to not be rigid on a leadership style, but be willing to change their leadership approach based on different situations on the project?
I think that's a relevant and complex question because one, I believe there's some common leadership principles that don't change. First of all, if there's something that's changing or dynamic, I would posit that it may be a management style or a communication style, especially if the project's changing or if, let's say, you have a very, very diverse team. I think that's where a lot of the dynamics occur. I'll give you an example. There's a series of workshops that I've started offering to some clients by request when they're launching difficult teams. I'm saying complex teams, say where there might be 5 companies involved, 10 to 20 different stakeholders. What's often very valuable is the way that those projects are kicked off. This happened with a client that asked me, how can we get everybody on the same page? And I asked him, well, what kind of processes and procedures do you have? And he had every known process there was, Lean, Six Sigma, Agile, everything. I said, that's great, but how well do you know each other when you start? And it turns out when they had kickoff meetings, they didn't really know each other very well at a fundamental level. So I found that it was very valuable to go through a workshop where you could capture expectations, definitions of a successful program, and exploring the differences in the functional groups at the time of the kickoff, and then get commitments to how a group was going to respond to each other. And I think that's a very powerful technique. We could call that a dynamic leadership style, but I think it's more of an open dynamic communication style and cultural style. You start any project, almost always the people who are involved in finance or project controls, they're not really necessarily going to be receptive to change, whereas a super creative person like an architect may feel that the definition of a successful project is being able to change anything at any time. And when you get those as initial expectations or definitions of a successful program, you already have a built-in conflict. So the question is, are you recognizing that and making commitments how you're going to communicate? So I think those are critical parts of the program because often we wait until the programs have gone off the rails and we can't recover them before we start asking those fundamental questions, and we can address those much earlier.
Also, you touched on a very important point that I want to expatiate a little bit more on. I see personally, leveraging leadership and networks is you're really trying to form a culture for your project team. You're really trying to define who we are, and the world is flat. And literally right now, you really have to consider the actual diversity of each project team. And I'm really talking about the cultural differences of each individual on a project. Because based on that, they actually have different methods and different perceptions around leadership, different norms, and different approaches to engaging. How does a project manager or a leader, factor in the diverse cultures of a team? And how do you actually, create a new norm and create your own team culture, taking into consideration the fact that now we have teams that actually are really very complex and have different backgrounds? How does the leader manage that kind of situation?
One, it's a challenge, and two, I was actually writing about that this morning. So let me, in my own journal. And one of the big keys there, I believe, and Jim Collins writes a lot about this, but I think one of the keys is alignment. And let me go deeper than that. Let me borrow something from the book Crucial Conversations. A crucial conversation occurs when there are big differences in opinion, passions run high, and the stakes are large. But let's just accept that as a terminology point. So if we want to have a crucial conversation, or let's say if in a leader role, we want to create an environment where people feel safety to talk, safe to react, safe to share. We are not going to be able to start that environment for that crucial conversation if we don't have mutual purpose. And that's worth thinking about long after this. If we have a very diverse team and in the leader role, we can't find something common for the group to rally around, we're probably going to fail. That's probably going to be the most important thing. If there's someone on the team with a completely different value set, or they're completely opposed to the rest of the team, that person might need to go somewhere else. It doesn't mean that we have to be rigid, but we have to find something common to rally around. And that, I believe, is probably the greatest challenge for the leader at the beginning. Because once we have mutual purpose, I would say we shift from the leadership to the management. Because if we want to maintain a crucial conversation or a safe environment, the only way we can sustain that then afterward is by mutual respect. And I think sometimes we focus on the mutual respect part or the way we conduct ourselves with each other. But if all we have is mutual respect, but we don't have a fundamental common connection or sense of mutual purpose, we're probably going to be kidding ourselves. And I think we've all had experiences before where we allowed someone to say to be on a team that did not align or had a completely different sense of purpose. But often we tolerated that person and the differences blow up later. So I think the concept of the mutual purpose and mutual respect from crucial conversation can guide us how to do that as a leader. It's a great question.
Okay, I'm going to have a final question. And Jim, thank you so much for your insights. If you don't mind placing the page that has your email ID, so that attendees could actually also reach out to you and engage you after the session. The final question that we have has to do with the fact that several organizations are actually adjusting and transitioning from traditional approaches in delivery to agile practices. And at the core of agile practices, or one of the principles, really focuses on servant leadership, and based on your expertise and your engagement and your wealth of experience engaging different industries, how are organizations responding to this leadership style, and how are they actually responding to this new approach of delivery and focusing on solution delivery?
My answer would be slowly. I believe that in many industries, This is my opinion. This is not from a book. This is from my own personal experience and working with maybe 1,500 people. I believe that the term servant leadership is somewhat overused. But I believe that what it means is when we're focusing on others rather than ourselves. And I think that it's related to, among other things, the focus on results versus the focus on people. That part I showed from Lieberman. And here's an example. When our company was acquired by that ITT company back in 2006, I could go to executive sessions where we talked about breakthrough, we talked about whatever the catchy phrase was, working on people, promoting other people. But when it came time to the end of the quarter, all everyone cared about was the bottom line. I found in practice, people say one thing often, but often they'll revert to just focusing on the results. I believe it is a slow process. I believe it's a slow, gradual process where organizations that are focusing more on people that are actually doing both are ones that are achieving better results and higher engagement. I think it's a slow series of steps moving in that direction. That's one of the reasons, going all the way back to the beginning, why it was such a positive thing to see when PMI added the leadership leg to the triangle. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'll tell you it's a big reason why I do this, because I want my experiences and stories and our leadership materials to bring that out. That really the key to a lot of lasting success, not just in work, but in life, to become effective a leader is really learning to serve others. And for some of us, we weren't trained that way. I don't think I was. So it's a discovery process for us, and a wonderful final question.
Jim, it has been a brilliant educative session, and I'm going to place a call to action for the attendees. Let's make it practical and network. So you have Jim's details right there. It's time to connect. You can reach out to Jim on LinkedIn, on his website. I'm really interested in checking out Choinque Cast, and that is the podcast. And let's connect and take the conversation outside of this room. Special thanks to PMI UAE chapter for making this webinar possible, a product of actually networking. And many thanks to our speaker, Jim Emerick. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you very much. Most grateful to meet all of you. Thanks.
Awesome. And as earlier mentioned, PDUs applicable to this session will be awarded to attendees. And with that, I would like to wish you all a brilliant evening or morning if you're in the United States or wherever in the world you are, and be safe. Webinar over.
Cheers.